the title is How I Nearly Terminated My Son Through Ignorance. My assumption was this was having a baby with Down syndrome was to be avoided, and that's why we have the screening, and that's why the doctors, there's this process. I just thought I wasn't going to risk it. And I say that on the Monday morning, I possibly made the best decision of my life by cancelling that amnio, because certainly it is something, had I proceeded and had the amnio, and obviously we'd have realised then that Tom has Down syndrome, I may well not be here, because it was certainly something we would have considered.
Nicola Enoch is the CEO and founder of Down Syndrome UK. Having pursued a successful career in retail consultancy, Nicola's life changed drastically in August 2004, when her son Tom was born with Down syndrome. Since then, Nicola has worked to provide information and support to expectant and new parents about the reality of living with Down syndrome. And Nicola joins me now. My first question then, Nicola, then is, what are the joys and challenges that you face having a son Tom with Down syndrome?
Okay. The joys are probably, I don't know. There are so many. I mean, he's just really good company. He's a pleasure to be with. We have a laugh. He doesn't take life seriously. He doesn't have all the hang-ups and concerns and worry about all the nonsense that I think we all get a little overwhelmed by and perhaps all too consumed by. So he's really refreshing. He doesn't, he's completely non-judgmental, and probably one of the least discriminatory people you'll ever meet, which is kind of obviously rather ironic given how much discrimination there is towards those with the condition. But yeah, he's just good fun. So in terms of joys, he just, makes my heart burst with pride and with love on a daily basis. So they're the greatest joys, and he just fits in the family and adores his sister as she does him. And then challenges, I think probably the greatest challenges that as a parent I face for Tom are those really kind of imposed by society and by the systems. So it just feels sometimes it's hard work, in fact, often. So I run a national charity, and I'm very immersed in the community, and just hear all too often how draining, if I'm honest, draining and demanding it can be, the sort of the toll it takes on parents in terms of applying for services, for the support. That's, I think, probably the greatest challenge. Tom in himself is not a challenge. It's the kind of the systems around him that make it harder for him to, well, not for him to be able to enjoy his life. He cracks on and gets on with his life, but for me to be able to sort of create opportunities perhaps for him. So
yeah, I think there's a lot of parents out there who are finding it such a fight to get the basic needs met or basic help for their child. So yeah, they're not alone. But how did you start with Down Syndrome UK?
Okay, well, it all started 20 years ago. Tom's 21 now, and when he was about a year old, I should say that when he was born, I kind of struggled enormously, but once I'd kind of got over it, as kids say, and adjusted and accepted Tom for exactly who he is, I realised I needed to connect with other families who had a child or young person with Down syndrome. And so originally I set up a local charity up in Warwickshire, where I'm based in the Midlands. That's the Ups of Downs, and that was 20 years ago, January 2006. So and I've been involved with that ever since. But I guess over the years I was noticing I'd meet other new parents, mostly mums, and they were all struggling and upset with the discovery that their baby has Down syndrome, the same as I'd been. And so I started to think, this is crazy, because I didn't need to have gone through all that, and they don't need to go through all that. So I, obviously through being online, but the internet, I could kind of connect with other families and was hearing the same sort of stories going on. All these new parents being devastated and feeling it was the end of their world, and then going on to discover it wasn't. And I also realised I'd never met anyone who was pregnant with a child with Down syndrome. I was only ever meeting those, who'd had an unexpected birth diagnosis. So sort of slowly realised that, that the majority of women who do discover their baby has Down syndrome were terminating. And as someone who'd sort of been, that's certainly sort of been on the horizon as a potential in my own situation, I realised, that something needed to be done. And it was about 8-9 years ago. Unusually, I'd connected with the local maternity unit, with the screening department, and said, that I'm happy to sort of provide information and support. And they put me in touch with an expectant couple. They were expecting a little boy via IVF, and I'd been in contact with them and had one call, I think it was, and some messages and so on. And then one day out the blue received a message from the mum saying that they'd chosen to terminate, and they'd done so because the doctor had told them that their son would suffer. And that really upset me. And it also made me really angry. Prior to my 2 children, I'd had recurrent miscarriages, and I knew how much I'd wanted a baby, and how devastating it was to have lost babies. And for that couple to have gone through IVF and then chosen to terminate, I really felt they deserved a lot better. And so that's what motivated me. I just thought, I've got to do something. I've had enough. I could see that the information being given out in hospitals was outdated. When Tom was born, he was born in 2004, and I was given something from the 1970s, 30 plus years old. And this was still going on, 10, 15 years later. And also the whole language and the assumptions in maternity and sort of screening and so on. So I just decided initially to launch PADS, Positive About Down Syndrome. I just wanted to be that antidote to all the negativity that's out there. So it was literally just a website to start off with. I was desperate. I knew how desperate I'd been when Tom was born to have some sort of insight into what his life might look like. Obviously no one can predict, although medics try to. But I was so ignorant. I had no idea about the condition. And therefore I was so influenced by sort of outdated stereotypes and attitudes that I wanted to provide the reality and insight into everyday life. And so PADS, the website, was created, and that's its aim, was just to provide everyday stories of our lives, not sugarcoating it, sharing stories for those, whose parents, whose little one had required heart surgery or bowel surgery, but also not just the medical narrative, which was so obviously prevalent in maternity services, but to provide what we call the lived experience, the social model. And so that's where it all started, was providing everyday stories, colourful photos, contemporary photos, to combat this sort of outdated stereotypes that perhaps people had in their minds. And it started, I think that was, I lose track of dates, I'm rubbish, 2017, I think that was launched.
Wow, I really admire you for your hard work and taking it off the ground, and you talked about your own personal story there with the medics, and I think in your TED talk you'd mentioned about maybe thinking I'll have an abortion. Was there pressure from the medical team to consider abortion with your son,
I'd
Tom?
say that was just the default.
The default, okay.
So yes, in my talk, I share how I'd been for the 20-week fetal anomaly scan on a Friday afternoon, and the sonographer had expressed concern that it looked like baby had talipes, which is clubfoot. And she said that can be indicative of a chromosomal abnormality such as Down syndrome. And the screening midwife had come in. I was upset and crying. And she said words along the lines of, don't worry, we can get it sorted. We'll book you in for an amniocentesis next week. I think it was the Wednesday or Thursday, certainly within a week. It was very quick. I don't remember being asked. It really just was, don't worry, this is what we can do. So I'd gone home and obviously jumped on Google, and over the weekend thought about how I could cope, my husband and I, how we would manage with a baby with a condition. First of all, thinking about talipes, I certainly thought, perhaps there's corrective surgery, physiotherapy might help. I didn't really know much about it, but it was really fear. And I think there's so much sort of stigma around conditions such as Down syndrome. And certainly that whilst, they hadn't forced termination on me, it certainly was, assumed. And the whole language, that Down syndrome was something to be avoided. The sonographer used the term chromosomal abnormality. We as a charity have sort of done a lot of work around that, the language of abnormality, disorder, defect, anomaly, all of that language. When you're talking about someone's precious unborn and or newborn baby is so loaded and directive. And of course, in antenatal screening, they would always refer to the risk of having a baby with Down syndrome. And so, my assumption was this was having a baby with Down syndrome was to be avoided, and that's why we have the screening, and that's why the doctors, there's this process. So, yeah, over that weekend, I'd thought very long and hard, and because of the miscarriages prior to Emily, our daughter, I just thought I wasn't going to risk it. And I say that on the Monday morning, I possibly made the best decision of my life by cancelling that amnio, because certainly it is something, had I proceeded and had the amnio, and obviously we'd have realised then that Tom has Down syndrome, I may well not be here, because it was certainly something we would have considered.
Yeah. Now, in the UK, around 90% of babies diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted. Does Down syndrome UK oppose abortion?
No, we don't oppose abortion. We're very much about supporting women. I personally believe it's a woman's right to have an abortion, a termination. But I absolutely believe that women, as I say, deserve so much better in terms of the language, the whole support. And we've got to stop this sort of assumption that because a woman, has a high chance or confirmed diagnosis, that she will even consider termination. I found it, I think it undermines a woman's autonomy. Certainly when I was pregnant with Emily, no one had ever suggested a termination. 3.5 years later, whilst pregnant with Tom, same marriage, same person, couple of pay rises, whatever, they were now suggesting to me I consider terminating this baby. And as I say, I think that absolutely undermines my autonomy. And it shouldn't just be this default position. If a woman chooses to terminate because the baby has Down syndrome, or for whatever reason she decides, then I respect that. And we've certainly had women join we have closed Facebook groups, and we have expectant women we're supporting, new parents, etc. And we have had women who've joined and who have chosen to terminate. And obviously I'm sad for them, but that's their choice. So as a charity, we're very much about supporting women, but also educating the professionals, enlightening the public, empowering people. I think there's so much work to be done because there's so much ignorance around the condition that makes people consider it. And I think the fact that medical practitioners, the whole language and that sort of narrative, that expectation makes people, I consider myself fairly well educated, but I found myself thinking, it must be really bad if the doctors are even that it's just suggested that, and the reality is so different. I know you yourself have a brother,
Yes.
Jack, who has the condition.
Exactly. And he brings a lot of joy.
And I'm sure
as well.
he brings you much joy, I hope.
Yeah, of course. But do you think education will reduce the number of abortions for people with Down syndrome in the UK?
I would imagine so, yes, because I do believe my TED talk the title is How I Nearly Terminated My Son Through Ignorance. And had I had that diagnosis, had I not had the support or the information, then I think I would have terminated. But I know, I meet plenty of women who've joined our groups and have perhaps been uncertain, perhaps been considering termination, and have continued. And, they will say to me, thank goodness they did. I don't, whilst we have supported a handful of women, who have left the group and terminated, certainly all the research we've undertaken has been of those who've continued and their pregnancies. It would be interesting and perhaps distressing to ask those women who do terminate, how much of it was through ignorance. But it's obviously such a sensitive, difficult subject. So all we can do is, as a charity, and me motivated as a parent and as a woman, is to educate. And then it's up to people to make their own choices. But, I believe that people with Down syndrome are the greatest educators, and it's great to see people with Down syndrome being far better represented, in, I don't know, on social media, on the telly, or things like that, because all of that then dispels a lot of the myths and removes the ignorance, because I always say you don't know what you don't know. And if I'd never met anyone with Down syndrome before I met Tom, so I'd only been influenced by the medical narrative, the language, the assumptions, and perhaps by very outdated attitudes. Tom is 21 now, so it was a wee while back. It's improving all the time. Social media obviously has a huge impact, I think, on getting knowledge out there and people with Down syndrome being able to be seen. So education's absolutely key. I would imagine it will reduce the number of terminations, but I don't have the statistics as evidence, I'm afraid.
That's okay. So with the rise of AI and screening, what are your thoughts on screening, and what are the experiences of women that you have met? And are there dangers with screening as well?
It's a difficult one. People sort of say, am I against screening? And I'm not. I think it opens a can of worms. And I think women's expectations need to be better managed. And, certainly we're supporting women whose pregnancies, I'd say, are not quite ruined, but certainly overwhelmed by the whole fear. And, they're afraid to go sort of for appointments. What are they going to say is the problem now? And almost don't sort of realize, obviously, the fetus is in utero, it's still developing, and conditions, come and go. And yet they're sort of worrying so much, which isn't good for them or the baby. So I think we are where we are, whether we like it or not. We have antenatal screening in the UK. And they talk about advancements, in technology. I suppose my frustration is that a lot of money is spent and a lot of time is spent on developing such technology. If I'm honest, perhaps, what's the motivation around identifying pregnancies? I don't know. Is it prevention's but cheaper than cure? And I think as a parent, I would far rather more money was spent on improving outcomes for people with Down syndrome, more opportunities, in terms of services and interventions and so on. So I think it's tricky. I think, society is such that they see advancements as a positive. I think it needs to be moderated, and certainly whilst women are being given more information around their pregnancies, in terms of the sort of medical side of it, that needs to be balanced with, well, not even with non-directive, sort of neutral, respectful language, contemporary understanding of conditions that are being screened for. Because I think technology is moving at a real pace. I think the lives of people with Down syndrome have improved drastically, certainly in my lifetime. But I don't think attitudes have caught up. And so I think you've got this sort of dichotomy of advanced technology, but outdated attitude still. And,
I think the fear is still there as well. I think there's fear of people who are not used to maybe seeing people with Down syndrome, or there can be that kind of fear around the diagnosis as well. But what are the stats then on positive support on antenatal versus postnatal when it comes to babies with Down syndrome?
In terms of the support from the healthcare professionals, it's not great, I'm afraid. We've done quite a lot of, we did a big study in 2019. That was 1,410 women, I think. Can't quite remember now. And then we've repeated the research with Warwick University, and that's been published over the last couple of years. And both, antenatally and postnatally, the support, the language is still wrong. The attitudes are wrong. I think it's slightly better now, perhaps in postnatal diagnosis, but we still see, sadly, an assumption towards termination. But it's also that sort of, for the expectant parent, that lack of support. There's a bit of a assumption that because a woman's chosen to continue, that she doesn't need any further support. It's like, well, you've made this choice, over to you. So that's really unacceptable, and needs to be improved. And one of the studies was looking specifically about the impact on women's mental health. And I was surprised, actually, that in the general population, I think the CQC data, I can't remember my figures exactly, but it was roughly about a third of women, 2/3 of women, more, 70% or so, in the general population felt well supported in maternity services. But of our families, it was 20 or 18%. So, only a fifth of our expectant new parents feel that they're being well supported. So there's a lot of work to be done. And certainly, for charities like ourselves, I think a lot of parents need to be connected with us, and I can sort of sense them, the relief as they join our groups. It's kind of like, I'm not alone, because I think as an expectant or new parent, when you receive a high chance or confirmed result, it feels really, really lonely. And so to be able to connect with others is huge, and we've done a lot of work with trying to work with maternity units for them to signpost to us, as well as us, delivering training and so on. We work with the Royal College of Midwives. That's on the sort of training side. But
and you're working, you're doing webinars. Can you share with our viewers more about the maternity webinars that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So we do them once a month. They're free lunchtime webinars that are primarily aimed at healthcare professionals. And we do them on a whole range of subjects, which of course I should be able to rattle off the top of my head, although they do change. But we look at, I think this month's is around the language in antenatal screening. So, because I do believe no one sets out to do a bad job. I think it's just, if you've been trained or you've heard, your peers, or using language like risk and abnormality, and that's what you're in your training and then everyday practice, you're not going to change it until someone actually says to you, have you considered that actually risk's quite offensive and really quite undirective? So the webinars are very informal. So this month's essay is on the importance of language, but we get different perspectives. So we have dads involved. We involve professionals as well, for them to sort of share. A lot of it's about sharing best practice, rather than just berating people and telling them what they're doing wrong, which is not the right approach. We sort of try and share, what does work well. We do a lot on breastfeeding. all sorts of subjects, but they're every month, and details on our website, Down Syndrome UK, for any healthcare professional. We do some specifically for health visitors, others for paediatricians, a whole range.
Fantastic. Now, have you had any success changing the language in the NHS?
Yes, yeah, there were several of us. I remember many years ago used to all connect online, and we'd say, "Oh, right, I'm going through the section on the." I mean, websites are huge, and the NHS is obviously ginormous. But we did get it all changed. The word abnormality and disorder were taken off. Risk was removed and changed to chance. We as a charity have undertaken freedom of informations with health trusts across the country. And I think when we last did, it was something like 48% were still using the word risk in their screening letters. We do need to repeat that FOI, but 52% or whatever had changed. So things are improving, and I know that they might feel small, but I think they're pretty significant because as if you know nothing about the condition, but you get a letter through the post that says, congratulations, the results are low, then you kind of go, oh, thank goodness, dodge that bullet. And conversely, if you have a midwife, a screening midwife phoning up saying, I'm really sorry, it's bad news, chances of baby having, the risk of having a baby with Down syndrome are high, then you don't even know anything about the condition, but your midwife's just told you it's bad news. So they're significant, I think, changes.
How can we present a more positive outlook for those with Down syndrome?
Well, certainly for us as a charity, that's what, I started doing was, I called it Positive About Down syndrome because, there was so much, I'll be polite, nonsense about Down syndrome already out there. But I think it's just about people becoming better informed. And I guess, it's about people with Down syndrome having greater opportunities. Tom went through mainstream primary and secondary schools, so he's grown up alongside a whole cohort in our community, who all now had seen someone with Down syndrome at their school. Whether they knew him or not would be another matter. At primary, I suspect they did because it was small. But at secondary, it was a huge school. But, a lot of young people will have grown up at least alongside someone with Down syndrome, and they'll perhaps have noticed or heard that he enjoys football, that he's now doing CrossFit. And I think it is just about people with Down syndrome being able to have opportunities to get out and live their best lives, whatever that might look like. So I do feel social media's been a bonus for our community. I think there's so many campaigns and things that charities and organisations run. But I think it's also great that, as I say, people with Down syndrome are now included. We had Ellie Goldstein on BBC Strictly Come Dancing in the last series. There's the fabulous George Webster as the CBeebies presenter. So children are growing up watching their everyday telly, and George is a member of the presenting team. He's not singled out. He's just a valued member alongside all the rest. And I think that removes that sort of genuine ignorance, because, you then have experience of someone with the condition.
Yes, you're seeing it now. You have that experience, and people are getting on just the finest, with Down syndrome, and they're able to have a great life despite the challenges. And just it's that chance for them to, be placed in new opportunities, new, experiences in life. I think that's what social media is doing, is giving them that chance to open doors for them. And we can see a lot of the children with Down syndrome getting personal trainers. I see a lot of that content online, and it's been fantastic to follow their journeys as well. So it's great.
People who are sort of models, or,
models
big
as
brands
well,
and so on. So again, it just, we're all afraid of the unknown, and if you remove that unbit and it all becomes known, then it's less scary. It's worth saying that, well, as in the main population, only a small percentage become TV presenters, or on, on the front cover of Vogue, obviously. People with Down syndrome, whatever their abilities, are all valued and loved by their families. And I think I often cite the research that was undertaken in the States probably about 10 years ago now. But when families were sort of asked, how do you feel about having a family member, a son or daughter with the condition, and parents were overwhelmingly proud, loved their child with the condition. Siblings the same. I think a handful said that they were embarrassed. I was embarrassed by my brother because he was a bright geek, who went to Cambridge University and read law, and I was like trying to be cool and everything, and he was my brother, so being embarrassed, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Something a lot of teenagers go through and so on. But really importantly, people with Down syndrome were asked about how they felt. And I think it was 100%, happy with their lives, 99%. I might be 98, but the vast majority, were happy with how they looked, their life, and so on. So the statistics are out there to prove, that people with Down syndrome do enjoy their lives. The vast majority of their families are grateful for having them in their lives. There are challenges for sure. And something like 15-20% of our community will have a dual diagnosis with autism. And I know for those families, there are greater challenges, as the young person has more needs. But that doesn't mean to say that they're not still loved, valued members of their families. And I think these are the sort of messages that need to be conveyed and people understood.
Thanks, Nicola, for joining me and for the work that you do.